Hello and welcome to another running video. As you can see, this is the 2nd of March 2025 and you can just see on my watch now it's about 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning and I'm off on my morning run. I've been having some trouble with this DJI Action camera that I use at the moment, DJI Action 2 camera that I'm using at the moment. The trouble I'm having is that it's not picking up my voice when I'm giving commentary while I'm running. Now, I've reset it a couple of times and it doesn't seem to be that doesn't seem to have made any difference. So the point is I'm recording the audio afterwards, so you're not getting that sniffling and snuffling and slapping of feet and crunching of gravel and all that sort of stuff that you get when I'm actually running. I don't know what the issue is, but I will just continue to use the camera the way it is and maybe try and sort out the issue. Otherwise I will just continue to record the audio post-run and hopefully it'll all make sense to you. Now, in today's video I'm going to talk to you about a bloke called Marty Sheargold, who you may not have heard of, and that's okay, and make a few comments about women's sport, in particular women's football, all brands of women's football, but in particular the Australian women's soccer or football team called the Matildas. Now, a couple of clarifications first. This Marty Sheargold bloke, I've never heard of him. I hadn't heard of him until this little imbroglio that he's been involved in the last few days. And I'm not here to defend him or apologise for him. I'm just here to make a few observations about things that he said and things that I think are reasonable comments. And the second clarification is that I don't watch a lot of sport on TV anymore. I sort of gave it away about 3-4 years ago, so I'm by no means an expert on women's sport or men's sport at the moment, or men's football or women's football, but I do think that there are some comments that I can make here that I think at least are worth thinking about and it worth at least considering. Now, to recap, those who had never heard of Marty Sheargold, and that's probably most people who live outside of Sydney, he was a radio announcer for the Triple M radio station. I don't know if his program was syndicated to the rest of their network or just to Sydney. So I don't really know what his ratings were, whether it was 3 Men and a Dog or a huge audience. But last Thursday or Friday, he made some rather intemperate, should I say, or offensive, dumb comments about women's football, that is round ball football, and the performance of the Matildas, and as a consequence of making those comments, after the keyboard warriors and the podcasters and the vloggers and all the other opinion writers that had their say, the radio station that he worked for, that is Triple M, decided the best thing that they should do was to part company with him. Now, I don't feel particularly sorry for him having lost his job, except to say that a family might now have lost their source of income, although he was probably paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for what he did, and also had a bit of a gig as a stand-up comedian, so I don't suppose he's going to be in the poorhouse. Nevertheless, I think that perhaps having lost his job might have been an overreaction, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. So what he actually said was that he would prefer to commit almost an act of cruelty on himself and on a particular part of his own body rather than watch women's football. He further said that the Matildas team, that is the women's football team, were behaving like a bunch of Year 10 schoolgirls, whinging and complaining and moaning and groaning and carrying on about their coach and training and how hard it all was, and complaining that one of their members was a bitch, just like a bunch of Year 10 schoolgirls. Now, there are a couple of issues with that. The first of all is his choice of words, and the second is his opinion about women's football. Now, as I say, I don't know this bloke. I've never listened to his program, so I don't know if he's just one of the regular roster of people that works for Triple M and plays music and announces, tells you what the songs are, and reads commercials and engages in inane chatter between all of those things, or his job is to be part of a panel of sports pundits. There were 3 people in the studio, 3 men in the studio, him and 2 others, when he made these comments. As I say, I don't know whether he's there just to make comments on the talking points of the day, or he's there to analyse women's sport, or analyse sport in general. But he's entitled to have an opinion about the performance of the Matildas. His choice of words was shall we say, at the very least unfortunate, but he's entitled to have an opinion about the performance of the Matildas, and presuming that's part of the job description for Triple M, he's entitled to express that opinion. As I say, his choice of words was at the very kindest unfortunate, and at the worst probably just plain dumb and offensive. The fact is the Matildas were playing in a FIFA-sanctioned international football tournament called the She Believes Cup. They'd played 3 games, they'd lost all 3, they'd had 8 goals scored against them, and I think maybe scored 2. So in anyone's language, in anyone's assessment of their performance, that is not a good performance. And if you were a man and a coach of a Premier League team or an A-League team and your club lost 3 games on the trot and had 8 goals scored against them and only scored 2, then the pundits would be calling for your head. We'll be starting to talk about whether you still had the support of the board and things like that. So criticism of sport by pundits is part of their job. And we would hope that they wouldn't pull their punches, they would be honest, they would be fair but honest, and they would criticise the performance either of the team or comment on the performance of an individual without getting personal. They would say things like, that player's not playing as well as he or she has done in the past, their form isn't what it was in the past, they don't appear to be playing with confidence, or they don't appear to be playing knowing what their job or their position or whatever it is, those sorts of issues. His choice of words in the first part of his description was just plain offensive, and in the second part was to say that these women were behaving like a bunch of Year 10 schoolgirls. Now, the best way to describe that section of his choice of words is to say that is one of those tropes of some lazy scriptwriter for a television series like Gossip Girls or Mean Girls or something like that, to assume that a bunch of grown women who are attempting to make a living from playing professional sport are behaving like schoolgirls is just plain insulting, and you certainly would not use similar language or similar descriptions to describe the performance of a men's team even if they had performed as poorly as the Matildas did. Now, the coach of the Matildas, when interviewed, said he was disappointed with the results, but he couldn't fault the effort. And that's fine, but we don't reward people on effort. We reward people and coaches, and we continue to select players on performance. And performance in sport means winning games and, where possible, winning tournaments. And by any measure, the performance of the Matildas in that international tournament was not acceptable, and it's reasonable to make a comment to say that. As I said, I'd never heard of this fellow before this particular incident, and as a result of people being outraged about it, the powers that be at Triple M Network decided it would be best if he and the network parted company. I assume he was given some pay out of his contract and he won't be going home with the backside hanging out of his pants. But as I said, perhaps their reaction was a little bit disproportionate to his offence, in the sense that what I think they should have done, and I'm not defending him by any means or excusing his behaviour, it was objectionable, it was insensitive, it was dumb. The choice of words was poor. There were other ways, as I've just said, to describe the performance of that team. There are other ways to comment on the performance of particular players without resorting to those sort of insulting terms that he did. Now, just because somebody's feelings are hurt doesn't mean that you get to be punished, but he, as a sports pundit, if that's his job, as a radio announcer or a comedian even, did a pretty lousy job of commenting fairly on the performance of the team. As I said, he could have simply said the performance of the team was not what we would expect from an Australian national team. He could have said that the performance of particular players was not what they had shown in previous games, that their form had dropped, their performance was not adequate for the match, and maybe the coach should be looking at them and seeing if they should be continued to be selected. but to reduce their effort to insults like behaving like Year 10 schoolgirls, and that's to insult Year 10 schoolgirls, to assume they all behave like whinging, squealing girls, is just plain insulting and wrong. What I think the radio station should have done is the very next day, they should have said to him, you are going to go on air tomorrow morning when your shift starts, or when your show starts. You're going to read a prepared statement that we will prepare for you, and you're going to read it again at the beginning of every hour of your program. And the prepared statement is going to say something along the lines of, yesterday I said some words that were insensitive and dumb. I behaved like a buffhead, and I unreservedly apologise for my comments and the language that I used. And as part of my ongoing training in how to be a decent human being, I have been given a season ticket to the Women's A-League, and I will be attending Women's A-League matches in the upcoming season, whenever that is, and I will be reporting on those matches in my show on the following Monday morning after having attended those weekend matches. I feel that that would have been a much more effective way of educating him as to how to comment on the performance of sporting teams. I feel it would have been a much more useful way to educate him on how to comment on the performance of women without resorting to gender-based insults. And I feel that it would have been a signal to say to him and the other two buffheads who were in the studio with him, sniggering at his remarks, that sort of commentary isn't what is expected or isn't what is required anymore. We're a bit more grown up, we're a bit more sensitive. We use language that is a bit more appropriate to describe performance where we see it's wanting, but we don't resort to personal insults and things of that nature that he did. And that brings us to the wider question of looking at women's sport, and in particular the various codes of football and the performance of women's teams relative to men's teams. Now, I get it, there are two different genders. You don't have to be as good as the men, you just have to be the best you can be. But, and it's a big but here, in all four codes of football in Australia, that is the two rugby codes, AFL and soccer, or football as it's properly known worldwide, men have been playing these games at a competitive level for close to 100 years. In fact, probably more than 100 years. In the NRL, it's well over 100 years since the NRL competition started. I believe it would be the same for the AFL. I don't know about the other two sports, but I would believe it's close to 100 years. So in human terms, those competitions are in their geriatric years. For the women's competitions, be it the NRLW, the AFLW, women's rugby or women's A-League or whatever it is, those competitions in their various iterations are probably still in their primary school years. So maybe they've made it to year 3, which would make them running for about 8 or 9 years or something like that. For 100 years or more, clubs and governing bodies have invested massive amounts of money, probably tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, in finding the best way to get the best performance out of male footballers. Money is spent at club level on dietitians, sports psychologists, nutritionists, physiotherapists, all sorts of people that are the backbone and the support structure around the player, so that when he goes out on the field, he is as best prepared as he possibly can be. And that's been going on for a very, very long time. And in the case of the NRL, when full-time professionalism came in, that is when players were paid solely to play football, and that came in around the time of the Super League War, which I'm thinking was probably 30 years ago, maybe more, but around 30 years ago, when that came when that full-time professionalism came into the NRL, it came in with a bang. And it's been growing exponentially ever since then. There are more assistant coaches than there's ever been. There's all sorts of other assistants who gather data and stats and video and nutritional data and so forth. Many, many more than there have ever been. And when those national teams, the Wallabies, the Kangaroos, the Socceroos, whenever they go on tour or they go to play in international tournaments, There are more support staff than there are actual players. There are more people that will carry gear and tell the players where to be, what to wear, when to be there, what to eat, when to eat it, what bus they've got to catch, when they've got to catch it, where they've got to catch it from, and then make sure they get off at the right stop. So if I'm making the point here, there have been an enormous amount of money spent on the men's version of all of the various football codes in this country, and there have been an enormous amount of resources devoted to getting the best performance out of those players. That has not been the case for the women's game. In some cases, the women's game was treated as a bit of a sort of circus side issue or a bit of a joke, and it's only now in the last year or two when crowds have gone up, television interest has been wider, sponsorship has become greater, the standard of play among the players has begun to improve, facilities have begun to improve, umpiring has improved, or refereeing and all those sort of things. All of those things have started to improve in the last year or two, and it's only been in the last year or two that in the AFL, for example, there's been a full competition with every AFL club having a women's team. It's the same in the NRL. It's only been in the last year or so that there's been a full NRL competition where every club now has a women's team. But despite that, the competition is often played at the end of the men's season rather than conjointly with it. In an ideal world, you might play the women's game before or even after the men's game on the same day at the same field. But we don't do that at the moment. So we're still not at the point of 100% parity, if you like, between the men's game and the women's game. And therefore, I think it's a reasonable thing to say that the standard of play in the women's game isn't the same as the standard of play in the men's game. Now, that's not to say that women have to be as good as men, but it's to say that there are men in particular, not all men, but some men perhaps are going to say, well, I like my football, but I only like watching men play football because they play it really well. They play at a high standard and the women just aren't there yet. Now, of course, there'll be some who say, I just want to watch women play because they're still at the point of enjoying the game and getting the thrill of being able to play, whereas much of the men's game, especially in all the codes, I think, is very programmed and very structured now. The coaches give the players lots and lots of instructions and lots of direction, and the game plan is very clear, and we never deviate from the game plan. And we go out and we do exactly what the game plan says we have to do. And the commentators can see what's going to happen before it happens. The coaches can see what's going to happen before it happens because they program the players to do it, and the spectators can see what's going to happen before it's going to happen. And so to some extent, the sheer joy and unbridled enthusiasm that you see in the women's game is perhaps a bit more entertaining, if not as skillful, as the men's game, that is. Now, I don't think it's sexist or misogynist or any of those derogatory terms that you might throw at men to say, well, the standard of play in the women's game at the moment isn't the same as the standard of play in the men's game. Now, you might argue, well, we're women, we're not meant to be playing to the same standard as men. No, that's true, but you are meant to be playing the best you can, and there are certain measures that we look at in a game of football, that is round ball football at the moment, to say, well, that's a really good game. It's entertaining. There were lots of skillful play. There were lots of skillful passing between the players, and there might have only been one goal from each team, or there might have even been no goals, but there was lots of really skillful entertainment. And the crowd enjoyed what they saw. Or if you're looking at a game of rugby league, there are measurements that the coaches and the pundits make of how many sets were completed, and how much yardage was gained in each play, and all that sort of stuff. And it may be that the women are not meeting those targets just yet, but in some ways their game is a little bit more entertaining, perhaps, because it's not quite as programmed. So to return to this Sheargold fellow, he's sitting in his studio in the radio studio thinking he'll make some comments about women's football. I don't know enough about him to know whether he's got any qualifications to make those. That is, whether he's watched enough games, whether he's followed the game long enough, whether he has any coaching qualifications, or he's been involved in the game in any way, shape or form. My own background is that in my younger years I played football, I coached football, I refereed football. So I feel that even though I'm not watching it at the moment, I can sit down and watch a game of football and with a reasonably informed brain look at it and say, the players are playing well, that's a good quality game of football, it's an entertaining game of football, and even though there were no goals scored, I still thought it was a good game or a quality game. I don't know if that's the case with Mr. Sheargold, but he thought, I'm going to make some comments about women's football, and let me find something to say that first of all will grab my audience's attention and they'll stay listening. So I'll threaten to do something absolutely disgusting to myself as a way of getting everyone's ears pricked up and paying attention. And then when I said that, and my two other buffhead mates have sniggered away in the background at what I just said, I'll then rubbish the women's performance by saying they're behaving like a bunch of schoolgirls. We hopefully are past that sort of behaviour. As I said, you're able to comment, you're able to say that the standard of play isn't as good as the men's, you're even able to say it's not as good as you would expect from that team and what that team has shown in previous games and in previous competitions. You're able to say that particular players are not, their form isn't as good as it's been in the past, they're not playing well today, they just seem to be off the pace or out of touch or out of position, or when they're on the ball they don't feel confident, and when they're not on the ball they're not in the place where they ought to be. You're allowed to say all those sort of things about a player. What you're not allowed to do is resort to personal types of comments that are deliberately meant to belittle or insult those people. Now, among the people who made comments, or some of the people who commented on Mr. Sheargold, the opinion writers who ironically thought it was okay to offer their opinion but felt he shouldn't have offered his opinion. I believe he had a right to have an opinion and to express an opinion. I just believe that the choice of words was dumb, foolish and insulting. And as I said, he should have been made to go on air next day and read a prepared statement that basically said that. And as part of an education program, he would be attending women's football in the next season and commenting with an informed base, even if he had to have a coach next to him to explain to him what was going on and things about the standard of play. But those, the keyboard warriors and so on, offered their opinions about him, and as I say, as a result, he one of the things that they said is that many a young girl who was currently playing football or thinking of playing football would now have their dreams dashed. And I hear that said many a time, and I feel that it's probably not so. This is my thinking. If you are a teenage girl or a teenager and you are now playing football, we're talking about round ball football, but any other code of football for that matter, but you're playing football with the expectation that you might get picked up by an A-League club, you might join the train-on squad, that someday you might make it to the young Matildas, whatever they're called, the under-17s or the under-20s, whatever they are, or even some stage in your life you might make it to the full Matilda squad. You are surely not going to throw all your toys out of your playpen and chuck in your commitment to the game because some bloke that you've never heard of before said a few dumb things on a radio program that you never listened to, and as a consequence of saying those, lost his job. If your commitment to the game is so shallow that that's what you're going to do, then you probably weren't ever going to make it to the big time in the sport anyway. It's okay to be annoyed and be cranky about what this fool said, but to suggest that as a result of that, you're going to throw all your toys out of the playpen and you're never going to play football again, or to suggest that mothers or fathers for that matter, who were thinking about what sport their little daughters might play, have now said, well, this idiot that I've never heard of, whose program I've never listened to, and I don't know anything about, he said a few disparaging comments about a few other footballers that I've never met, and he said a few dumb words and paid a price for saying those things, but as a result of him having said those insulting words, you're now not going to be able to play soccer or round ball football. You're going to have to go and take up another sport. I don't know what it would be, but we're not going to let you play soccer because this bloke said some dumb things, and we're just not letting you play that sport any longer. All right, well, those are my thoughts about Mr. Sheargold. I don't feel terribly upset about him having lost his job, but I do feel that perhaps the radio station's response was disproportionate, and I've suggested what they should have done instead. I feel that if he had form in this area before and he'd said dumb things like this before, then the radio station is at fault, but also the public who listen to this bloke are at fault, because the bottom line of any person who's in the entertainment business, be it on radio or television, is if nobody watches you and nobody listens to you, you're not going to be there very long. Very simply, the sponsors, the people who advertise on your program, are advertising because there are listeners or there are viewers. If the ratings show that no one's listening to you or no one's watching your program, then it's not going to be on for very long. And if you're deemed to be the problem, you won't be there very long. So whether the sponsors are walking away from him or not is a matter for the radio station to determine. But as I said, I believe that they would there was a better way to handle the situation. I don't necessarily feel that losing his job was the end of the world. It probably isn't for him. He'll probably find another one fairly shortly, or start a podcast or something like that, and continue to do his stand-up comedy. And that's good luck. That's fair enough. He's entitled to do that. But I feel that perhaps the radio station should have done as I suggested and made him read an on-air statement admitting to being a buffhead, and as part of his education he would be attending the A-League and the Matildas games next year and getting some instructions from a coach to understand the nuances of the game and how the team was performing. All right, well, that's my opinion. If you have a comment or a thought, then you know what to do. If you'd like to share the video or subscribe to the channel or any of those things, you're more than welcome to. And when I become aware of your comments, I will respond to them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you when I'm making the next running video, whenever that might be.